Welcome, my soft-thinking listener. You've found yourself in the company of the Sleepy Sloth once again. A slow, scientifically minded fellow who enjoys facts, tentacles, stripes, and curious little creatures, and things that slink, flutter, or scuttle through our quiet world. I must tell you something before we begin. Today, I consider myself a scientist in the study of animal myths and misunderstood behaviors. A scientist who is almost always correct, except for those few times when I am not. But even then, I prefer to drift gently onward, rather than fuss over it. Because what truly matters is the information itself. Before I start, please, let me know. What is the most boring thing you would secretly love hearing about? Let me know gently in the comments. Now, let us begin today's episode of Contemporary Animal Myths. In the softly mysterious depths of the 21st century, a quietly persistent idea has floated through the imagination of many, that octopuses are solitary creatures, always drifting alone through their watery realms. No one asked for this. And yet, here we are, pondering these eight-limbed enigmas. While many octopus species do indeed prefer solitude, exploring dens, rocks, and coral caves with slow, careful movements, some species exhibit subtle social behaviors, gathering briefly in small groups, communicating through color changes and gentle posturing. Imagine softly a shadow gliding along a mossy seabed, tentacles brushing the sand, eyes blinking slowly, always aware, sometimes encountering another creature with cautious curiosity. These interactions are brief, quiet, almost imperceptible, yet they challenge the simplistic notion of absolute solitude. This fact is not exciting, not even a little bit. And that is just perfect. Each arm, each chromatophore pulse, each slow sweep across the sand. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely unnoticed by human observers. Yet quietly persistent in the rhythms of ocean life, a delicate reminder that solitude and sociability exist along a subtle continuum. In another quietly circulating observation, humans often believe that all bees die after stinging. Picture, softly, a honeybee hovering above a gently swaying flower, legs dangling, wings trembling with quiet effort. Only honeybee workers that sting mammals experience the fatal tearing of their stinger, a slow and tragic process for the insect. Other bees, including males and species that sting insects, survive without such consequence. Imagine softly the slow rhythm of flight, the delicate brushing of pollen against fuzzy legs, the gentle hum vibrating through a warm summer air. Entirely ordinary, entirely functional, entirely precise. The myth exaggerates mortality, transforming defensive behavior into universal sacrifice. Each careful landing, each slow press of a stinger, each quiet buzz. Entirely ordinary, entirely biological, entirely precise. A small whisper of evolution at work. Some whisper, perhaps because they wish it were true, that pandas are poor climbers. Yet, softly, envision a giant panda navigating the mossy trunks of a forest, claws sinking into bark, muscles shifting with careful deliberation. Despite their bulky size and quiet lumbering gait, pandas climb adeptly to reach resting places or young shoots. Each gentle grasp, each calculated step, each slow weight shift. Entirely ordinary, entirely effective, entirely surprising to those who imagine clumsy bears instead of deliberate climbers. The myth drifts gently, softening reality into simplicity, ignoring the subtle intelligence of paw placement, balance, and spatial awareness that enables pandas to navigate vertical space with care. Another quiet notion whispers that goldfish grow only to the size of their bowls. Picture, softly, a fish gliding slowly through water, scales catching the light like drifting leaves, exploring the boundaries of its environment with a measured, lazy motion. In larger, properly maintained habitats, goldfish grow far beyond what tiny bowls permit, sometimes doubling or tripling expected size. This slow, constrained growth arises from limited space, water quality, and nutrition rather than inherent limitation. Imagine softly. Fins undulating in gentle arcs, eyes blinking at floating plants, each movement measured, each breath entirely ordinary. Entirely responsive to environment, entirely alive. The myth simplifies, compresses, and understates the potential of life, quietly reminding us of the delicate interaction between creature and surroundings. A gentle, persistent tale drifts through many minds, that tarantulas are deadly to humans. Imagine softly. A spider poised in the warm corner of a terrarium, legs brushing the surface, hairs barely moving, fangs poised but rarely engaged. In truth, tarantula venom is mild, comparable to a bee sting in toxicity for humans, though local irritation may persist. Bites occur rarely, and fatalities are essentially non-existent. Picture. Softly. The slow movement of limbs, the quiet sensing of vibrations in the air, the careful consideration of every step. Entirely ordinary, entirely cautious, entirely biological. The myth exaggerates threat into fearsome legend, drifting gently through media and whispered warnings, softening reality into something dramatic yet unnecessary. Each hair, each careful crawl, each hesitant pause. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely adapted. And in another gently circulating misconception, dolphins are often imagined as creatures that never attack. Picture. Softly. A pod moving through calm waters, glistening bodies slipping with rhythmic grace. While documented rescues of humans exist, dolphins may be aggressive, especially in social disputes or during feeding interactions. Each gentle arc of a dorsal fin, each subtle nudge, each quiet click of echolocation. Entirely ordinary, entirely context-dependent, entirely alive. The myth elevates friendliness into perfection, drifting through human imagination, softening complex behavior into simplistic benevolence. Each interaction, each gentle glide, each observed behavior. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely nuanced. A quiet, careful dance of intelligence and circumstance. A softly circulating thought of our 21st century imagination suggests that only male lions have manes. Imagine gently. A sun-warmed savanna, grasses whispering in the wind, a lioness stepping carefully between shadows, eyes flicking toward distant movement. While the common expectation is that manes are a purely male feature, some lionesses do develop mane-like growths due to hormonal conditions, particularly elevated levels of testosterone or adrenal changes. Each sparse strand, each subtle curl of fur around the neck, each gentle ripple in the sunlight. Entirely ordinary, entirely biological, entirely fascinating in its quiet precision. Observers have long associated manes with masculinity, dominance, or maturity, quietly ignoring the subtle endocrinological whispers that occasionally grant a female a similar crown. The myth simplifies, smooths, and categorizes, compressing nature into tidy binaries, yet the natural world delights in gentle exceptions, softly reminding us that biology is never fully predictable. Picture. Softly. The wind brushing through a half-maned lioness's fur, each movement slow and deliberate, muscles shifting beneath skin, eyes observing with calm awareness. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. The story of who wears a mane and why drifts quietly through books, documentaries, and casual conversation, softening complex physiology into simplistic image, yet the truth remains quietly persistent, a gentle whisper of endocrine subtlety, entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely unhurried. In another quietly persistent notion, butterflies live only a day. Imagine softly. A meadow glimmering in morning light, petals trembling with dew, a delicate butterfly unfolding wings for the first time. While certain species, like the mayfly, like adults of brief-lived genera, have fleeting lifespans, most butterflies live for weeks or even months, passing through multiple days of nectar gathering, mating flights, and slow sunbathing. Each vein of each wing, each tiny antenna moving with careful sensory precision, each subtle heartbeat. Entirely ordinary, entirely delicate, entirely purposeful. The myth compresses fleeting visual impressions into generalized brevity, drifting through casual observation and poetic imagery, yet ignores the slow passage of days that mark real butterfly life. Picture. Softly. A monarch alighting on milkweed, wings quivering slightly in the breeze, body oriented with care, proboscis extended. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each day unfolds, each movement considered, each pause to rest on a sun-warmed leaf. Entirely ordinary, entirely measured, entirely precise. This gentle exaggeration transforms longevity into ephemeral beauty, drifting quietly into stories and illustrations, a subtle misperception made soft by poetic imagination. Some quietly imagine snapping turtles cannot release their bite until thunder echoes across the sky. Picture. Softly. A pond's edge, algae drifting lazily, a turtle clamping slowly on a stick or unsuspecting finger. In truth, snapping turtles release their grip when muscles relax, entirely independent of meteorological events. Thunder is irrelevant. Each bite, each slow clamping motion, each subtle shift of jaw muscles. Entirely ordinary, entirely muscular, entirely precise. Observers, fascinated by sudden, firm resistance, imagine dramatic associations with storms, transforming biological mechanics into weather-related folklore. Picture. Softly. The slow uncoiling of a jaw, the gentle relaxation of tension, the careful withdrawal from an object. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive. The myth persists, quietly misattributing natural biomechanics to dramatic cause, drifting through human imagination, softening function into story. A quietly repeated notion whispers that houseflies live only 24 hours. Imagine softly. A sunlit windowsill, a fly perched delicately on a pane, legs vibrating gently, wings resting in stillness. In reality, common houseflies can live for several weeks, depending on temperature, food availability, and reproductive status. Each careful step, each subtle wing movement, each slow antenna sweep. Entirely ordinary, entirely rhythmic, entirely biological. The myth simplifies lifespan, compressing hours into a single imagined day, drifting through casual observation and the poetic allure of fleeting insects. Picture. Softly. The gentle flick of wings as the fly moves to a sunbeam, body vibrating with warmth, legs adjusting weight. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive. The gentle exaggeration softens reality into brevity, transforming ordinary lifespan into compressed drama. Another quietly circulating misunderstanding suggests that all ants are female. Imagine softly. A slow line of tiny workers navigating moss and soil, antennae waving, mandibles opening and closing. In truth, males exist, though their role is mostly fleeting, short-lived breeders who emerge to mate and then die, leaving the colony to the industrious females. Each tiny leg movement, each careful antenna sweep, each slow deposit of pheromones. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely social. The myth simplifies the complex caste system, compressing nuanced life cycles into a single, quiet misunderstanding. Picture. Softly. A male ant briefly joining the worker's path, motion delicate, lifespan ephemeral, entirely ordinary, entirely biological. Myths drift gently through observation and simplification, softening the intricate subtleties of ant society into tidy narrative, entirely harmless, entirely persistent, entirely ordinary. A quietly whispered belief drifts through some minds in the 21st century. That animals can reliably predict earthquakes. Imagine softly. A dew-laden field at dawn, rabbits pausing mid-hop, birds fluttering through still air, dogs lying quietly near human dwellings. Observers have long noted subtle changes in behavior before tremors, interpreting sudden restlessness, unusual calls, or hurried retreats as prophetic. Yet, evidence remains inconsistent and anecdotal. Some animals may sense vibrations or subtle shifts in the Earth's crust, but these behaviors are neither universal nor reliably predictive. Each twitch of an ear, each cautious glance, each slow shift of weight. Entirely ordinary, entirely responsive to immediate environment, entirely natural. Humans, longing for patterns, quietly project anticipation onto observed behaviors, connecting cause and effect where none reliably exists. Imagine softly. A deer pausing beside a brook, nostrils flaring, ears pivoting, eyes scanning shadows. Entirely ordinary, entirely cautious, entirely alive. The myth drifts through stories, reports, and folklore, softening observation into certainty, a gentle exaggeration of attentiveness into prophecy. Each pause, each twitch, each subtle movement. Entirely ordinary, entirely biological, entirely unspectacular. Another quietly circulating idea imagines whale sharks as dangerous to divers. Picture. Softly. Turquoise water shimmering, sunrays filtering down, a whale shark gliding slowly past coral and rocks. These gentle giants, enormous yet delicate in their movements, are filter feeders, consuming plankton, tiny fish, and small organisms, posing virtually no threat to humans. Each slow sweep of the mouth, each undulating movement of fins, each measured turn of the massive body. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely non-threatening. Observers, dazzled by size and shadow, may exaggerate risk, softening graceful biology into imagined menace. Imagine softly. A diver drifting beside the creature, current moving hair and fabric slowly, observing slow-motion elegance, entirely ordinary, entirely peaceful, entirely natural. The myth persists quietly in casual conversation, softening awe into imagined danger, entirely harmless, entirely persistent. Some quietly imagined vultures circle only above dying animals. Picture. Softly. Warm air currents rising from a sunlit valley, wings stretching wide, feathers catching light, birds riding thermals with gentle precision. While they do feed on carrion, vultures also use thermals to travel efficiently, sometimes gliding for kilometers with no carcass beneath. Each slow flap, each subtle tilt of body, each gentle adjustment to wind currents. Entirely ordinary, entirely aerodynamic, entirely alive. Humans, observing from below, may misinterpret graceful soaring as omen or signal, softening natural movement into prescient behavior. The myth drifts, soft, persistent, entirely harmless, entirely ordinary. A quietly circulating belief imagines flamingos are pink from birth. Picture. Softly. A shallow lagoon, mist hovering above water, hatchlings wobbling on stubby legs. In truth, they emerge gray or whitish, gradually acquiring pink and coral hues through a diet rich in carotenoid pigments from algae, crustaceans, and small invertebrates. Each subtle preening motion, each careful peck at tiny morsels, each gentle shake of wings. Entirely ordinary, entirely nutritional, entirely natural. The myth simplifies transformation into innate color, softening biological development into imagined instant beauty. Imagine softly. A group of young birds, feathers muted, slowly growing the hues of their environment, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Another gently drifting notion suggests hummingbirds migrate on the backs of geese. Picture. Softly. Flowering meadows and distant mountains, tiny hearts beating rapidly, wings vibrating almost imperceptibly. In reality, hummingbirds migrate independently, propelled by their own extraordinary endurance and high metabolism. Each measured wingbeat, each careful orientation to wind currents, each delicate feeding pause. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely natural. The myth arises from whimsical imagination, softening remarkable self-sufficiency into borrowed effort. Imagine softly. A hummingbird pausing midair, sipping nectar, wings shimmering, entirely alive, entirely ordinary. The story drifts through books and conversation, quietly transforming independence into fanciful assistance, gentle, harmless, persistent, entirely ordinary. A quietly circulating idea drifts softly through the minds of ocean watchers in the 21st century. That sea otters hold hands only when sleeping. Picture. Gently. A misted kelp forest, water moving with slow rhythm, otters floating on their backs, paws entwined, fur glistening with dew-like droplets. While hand-holding, or rafting, is most often observed during sleep, it also occurs during rest, grooming, or moments of gentle social bonding, entirely ordinary behaviors meant for stability and connection rather than symbolic ritual. Each delicate paw clasp, each slow shift of floating body, each subtle blink of dark eyes. Entirely ordinary, entirely social, entirely alive. Humans, enchanted by the tender image, may simplify the behavior into a single sleepy gesture, softening complex sociality into quiet symbolism. Imagine softly. A mother otter curling near her pup, small limbs wrapped gently, currents brushing past, entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely natural. The myth drifts gently through nature documentaries and casual observation, transforming ordinary comfort into poetic imagery, entirely harmless, entirely persistent, entirely otter. A quietly persistent belief imagines that pufferfish explode when threatened. Picture. Softly. A coral outcrop, water shimmering, a small fish pausing, fins trembling ever so slightly. In reality, pufferfish inflate by swallowing water or air, enlarging themselves to appear formidable and deter predators. They do not explode. Each slow intake, each subtle flex of muscles, each delicate ripple across spines. Entirely ordinary, entirely defensive, entirely natural. Observers, imagining sudden expansion, may exaggerate risk, softening survival behavior into cinematic danger. Imagine softly. A pufferfish floating, expanded but calm, currents brushing scales, entirely alive, entirely precise. The myth drifts through casual conversation, softening biology into hyperbole, entirely harmless, entirely persistent. Some quietly believe starfish can survive being cut in half. Picture. Softly. A shallow tide pool, sun filtering through gentle ripples, a starfish pressed against smooth rock. In truth, only when the central disc remains intact can a starfish regenerate lost arms. Separation of the disc is fatal. Each slow contraction, each subtle ripple along arms, each gentle movement of tube feet. Entirely ordinary, entirely regenerative, entirely precise. The myth drifts through folklore and casual misobservation, softening precise biology into fantastical resilience. Imagine softly. A starfish resting, slowly flexing limbs, entirely alive, entirely ordinary. Another gently whispered notion is that bats always hang upside down. Picture. Softly. A shadowed cave, air cool and still, a bat clinging gently to a ledge. While many species roost inverted, some species adopt different orientations in foliage or crevices. Each slow reposition, each subtle twitch of wings, each measured adjustment of claws. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. Humans observing fleeting glimpses may assume uniformity, softening diversity into simplification. Imagine softly. A bat nestled, adjusting, breathing slow. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive. A quietly circulated idea suggests snakes unhinge their jaws to eat large prey. Picture. Softly. A sun-warmed forest floor, leaves drifting lazily, a snake extending its mouth around a small meal. In reality, highly flexible ligaments allow the jaws to stretch widely, but they do not truly unhinge. Each slow muscular stretch, each subtle repositioning of teeth, each measured swallowing motion. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers imagine dramatic unhinging, softening ligament flexibility into imagined spectacle. Imagine softly. The snake breathing, digesting, resting. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely unremarkable in its quiet perfection. A quietly circulating idea drifts softly through the minds of ocean watchers in the 21st century. That sea otters hold hands only when sleeping. Picture. Gently. A misted kelp forest, water moving with slow rhythm, otters floating on their backs, paws entwined, fur glistening with dew-like droplets. While hand-holding, or rafting, is most often observed during sleep, it also occurs during rest, grooming, or moments of gentle social bonding, entirely ordinary behaviors meant for stability and connection rather than symbolic ritual. Each delicate paw clasp, each slow shift of floating body, each subtle blink of dark eyes. Entirely ordinary, entirely social, entirely alive. Humans, enchanted by the tender image, may simplify the behavior into a single sleepy gesture, softening complex sociality into quiet symbolism. Imagine softly. A mother otter curling near her pup, small limbs wrapped gently, currents brushing past, entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely natural. The myth drifts gently through nature documentaries and casual observation, transforming ordinary comfort into poetic imagery, entirely harmless, entirely persistent, entirely otter. A quietly persistent belief imagines that pufferfish explode when threatened. Picture. Softly. A coral outcrop, water shimmering, a small fish pausing, fins trembling ever so slightly. In reality, pufferfish inflate by swallowing water or air, enlarging themselves to appear formidable and deter predators. They do not explode. Each slow intake, each subtle flex of muscles, each delicate ripple across spines. Entirely ordinary, entirely defensive, entirely natural. Observers, imagining sudden expansion, may exaggerate risk, softening survival behavior into cinematic danger. Imagine softly. A pufferfish floating, expanded but calm, currents brushing scales, entirely alive, entirely precise. Its skin, delicate yet resilient, shifts subtly as tiny dermal muscles adjust the surface, maintaining symmetry while water fills internal cavities. The gentle bulging, slow and rhythmic, is entirely a mechanism of survival, a quiet ballet of biology, not chaos. Such myths, whispered among divers, aquarium enthusiasts, and casual storytellers, transform careful defensive inflation into imagined spectacle, softening ordinary biology into dramatic imagination. Observe. Softly. Each spine, each bulge, each careful shift in position. Entirely ordinary, entirely purposeful, entirely calm, and entirely unhurried, like the water itself flowing over coral with timeless patience. The myth drifts through casual conversation, softening biology into hyperbole, entirely harmless, entirely persistent, and entirely serene. Some quietly believe starfish can survive being cut in half. Picture. Softly. A shallow tide pool, sun filtering through gentle ripples, a starfish pressed against smooth rock. In truth, only when the central disc remains intact can a starfish regenerate lost arms. Separation of the disc is fatal. Each slow contraction, each subtle ripple along arms, each gentle movement of tube feet. Entirely ordinary, entirely regenerative, entirely precise. The regenerative process is slow and meticulous, a quiet reshaping of cells, tissues, and skeletal structures over many weeks, almost imperceptible to hurried eyes. The myth drifts through folklore and casual misobservation, softening precise biology into fantastical resilience. Imagine softly. A starfish resting, slowly flexing limbs, entirely alive, entirely ordinary, its central disc quietly orchestrating growth, sending microscopic signals through its radial nerves, guiding cells to reform lost limbs, entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely mesmerizing in its unhurried perfection. Each tiny tube foot adhering to the rock, each arm curling and stretching, each slow pulse of water passing over its surface. Entirely ordinary, entirely patient, entirely natural. Another gently whispered notion is that bats always hang upside down. Picture. Softly. A shadowed cave, air cool and still, a bat clinging gently to a ledge. While many species roost inverted, some species adopt different orientations in foliage or crevices. Each slow reposition, each subtle twitch of wings, each measured adjustment of claws. entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. The muscles in the bat's feet, softly locking and releasing with ease, allow rest without exertion, conserving energy through long, slow nights. Humans observing fleeting glimpses may assume uniformity, softening diversity into simplification. Imagine softly. A bat nestled, adjusting, breathing slow, the fur catching specks of drifting dust, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each ear twitching in response to distant echoes, each wing subtly folding, each quiet heartbeat resonating in the stillness of the cave. Entirely ordinary, entirely meticulous, entirely serene. The myth, carried on in stories and illustrations, quietly drifts through imagination, softening adaptive flexibility into imagined consistency, entirely harmless, entirely calm. A quietly circulated idea suggests snakes unhinge their jaws to eat large prey. Picture. Softly. A sun-warmed forest floor, leaves drifting lazily, a snake extending its mouth around a small meal. In reality, highly flexible ligaments allow the jaws to stretch widely, but they do not truly unhinge. Each slow muscular stretch, each subtle repositioning of teeth, each measured swallowing motion. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Tendons and ligaments glide with gentle friction, bones shifting incrementally, muscles coordinating in a slow, careful rhythm. Entirely ordinary, entirely mechanical, entirely fascinating in their subtlety. Observers imagine dramatic unhinging, softening ligament flexibility into imagined spectacle. Picture. Softly. The snake's throat pulsing as the meal advances, scales glinting faintly, the body coiling with minimal exertion, entirely ordinary, entirely graceful, entirely natural. Each pause, each contraction, each slow swallow. Entirely ordinary, entirely unremarkable, entirely precise, a quiet reminder of evolution's patient attention to detail. The myth drifts through human perception, softening ordinary feeding into imagined horror, entirely harmless, entirely persistent, entirely gentle. A quietly persistent idea drifts through some corners of human imagination. That animal mothers will kill any offspring touched by humans. Picture. Softly. A dappled forest floor, sunlight filtering through leaves, a small nest resting against moss-covered twigs. Observers notice cautious parents and assume that human contact guarantees abandonment or harm. Yet, most animal mothers tolerate limited human contact, often returning to care for their young once disturbances cease. Each careful inspection, each slow approach, each gentle retreat. Entirely ordinary, entirely protective, entirely precise. Maternal instincts are guided by sensory cues, scent, movement, and auditory signals, rather than by a simple, automatic reaction to human touch. Imagine softly. A bird hovering near its nest, wings flicking gently, eyes alert yet calm, entirely ordinary, entirely attentive, entirely alive. The myth exaggerates protective behavior into absolute fatality, softening natural responses into imagined catastrophe. Each subtle chirp, each flutter of feathers, each cautious adjustment of eggs. Entirely ordinary, entirely deliberate, entirely serene, drifting softly through stories and whispered warnings. The human mind, ever eager to perceive consequence, transforms careful care into imagined certainty. Entirely harmless, entirely persistent, entirely gentle. Another gently circulated notion claims dogs eat grass only when sick. Picture. Softly. A backyard, early morning dew glinting on blades of grass, a dog sniffing, lifting a paw, lowering its muzzle to taste. While occasional grass consumption can indicate digestive upset, dogs also eat grass simply for enrichment, exploration, or the sensory pleasure of texture and taste. Each slow bite, each deliberate chew, each measured sniff. Entirely ordinary, entirely curious, entirely adaptive. Imagine softly. The gentle rustle of leaves, the dog pausing to listen, tail swaying lightly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. The myth simplifies a multifaceted behavior into a single cause, softening natural curiosity into assumed illness. Each exploratory nibble, each cautious paw step, each subtle head tilt. Entirely ordinary, entirely harmless, entirely serene, drifting quietly through human expectation and observation. A quietly imagined story tells that all swans are white. Picture. Softly. A tranquil lake, water shimmering, reeds swaying, a swan gliding with delicate movements. In reality, many species of swans display black plumage, such as the black-necked swan or the black swan, their feathers absorbing light differently and reflecting subtle hues. Each slow stroke of wings, each gentle dip of the beak, each quiet ripple across the water. Entirely ordinary, entirely varied, entirely precise. Humans observing only familiar white swans generalize, softening diversity into imagined uniformity. Imagine softly. A black swan resting, feathers sleek, eyes blinking slowly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. The myth drifts softly through folklore, softening biological variety into imagined monotony. Each feather, each quiet shift, each gentle exhalation. Entirely ordinary, entirely calm, entirely serene. Another quietly persistent belief is that all pit bulls are inherently aggressive. Picture. Softly. A suburban yard, sunlight diffusing through leaves, a dog padding quietly over grass. In reality, breed alone does not determine aggression. Temperament, upbringing, socialization, and environment guide behavior. Each slow wag of a tail, each gentle sniff, each measured interaction with humans or other animals. Entirely ordinary, entirely social, entirely precise. Observers may focus on dramatic anecdotes, softening nuance into stereotype. Imagine softly. A pit bull resting, ears flicking, eyes attentive yet calm, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. The myth drifts softly through media and conversation, exaggerating potential into certainty. Each cautious step, each patient pause, each quiet moment of calm. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely gentle. A softly circulated notion whispers that penguins get cold without sweaters. Picture. Softly. A rocky shore, waves lapping quietly, a penguin waddling slowly across pebbles. In truth, sweaters were used during oil spill recovery to prevent feathers from sticking together, not for daily warmth. Each slow step, each careful preen, each subtle shake of water from feathers. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. Humans observing these small garments may generalize need, softening specialized intervention into imagined necessity. Imagine softly. A penguin standing, wind brushing feathers, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each feather, each measured movement, each calm pause. Entirely ordinary, entirely serene, entirely gentle. A quietly circulating idea suggests that drowned bees can be revived by feeding them sugar water. Picture. Softly. A small garden, sunlight drifting through the leaves, a tiny bee resting motionless on a dewy petal. Observers, wishing to help, might place drops of sugar solution near the bee's mouthparts, imagining restoration of life. Yet, in truth, once a bee has drowned, cellular damage from water immersion is irreversible. Sugar water may provide energy to exhausted or chilled bees that are still alive, aiding recovery from fatigue, but it cannot reverse true drowning. Imagine softly. The delicate structure of legs, antennae twitching, wings folded. Entirely ordinary, entirely fragile, entirely alive. Humans, driven by compassion, may project revival onto chemical stimulation, softening biological finality into imagined possibility. Each careful drop of liquid, each subtle movement of mandibles, each hesitant stretch of legs. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely gentle. The myth drifts quietly through gardening lore, softening the limits of entomology into hopeful speculation. Imagine softly. The bee warming under sunlight, droplets glistening nearby, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each slow flutter of wings, each calm exhalation, each faint vibration of tiny muscles. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. Another softly persistent story claims that crows drop nuts only under cars to crack them. Picture. Softly. A suburban street, fallen leaves drifting lazily, a crow perched quietly above, eyes glimmering in muted light. In reality, crows use hard surfaces in general, rocks, pavement, even tree roots, to break open nuts. Vehicles are incidental, not essential. Each careful flight, each measured drop, each soft landing. Entirely ordinary, entirely deliberate, entirely precise. Humans observing cars beneath nuts may exaggerate causal links, softening general intelligence into specific theatrics. Imagine softly. A nut hitting pavement with a muted crack, crow observing patiently, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. The myth drifts gently through observation and storytelling, softening keen problem-solving into convenient spectacle. Each subtle hop, each quiet tilt of head, each flutter of feathers. Entirely ordinary, entirely calm, entirely serene. A quietly circulating notion tells that all clownfish are male. Picture. Softly. A sunlit coral reef, water shimmering, small fish gliding among branches. In reality, clownfish are born male, but dominant individuals can become female, creating a fluid social hierarchy. Not all remain male forever. Each slow swim, each gentle nudge within the anemone, each measured pulse of fins. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. Observers, focusing on early development, may oversimplify sex determination, softening complex social biology into absolute statements. Imagine softly. A small clownfish hovering near anemone tentacles, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each subtle color shift, each pause mid-water, each tiny tilt of body. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. Another softly persistent idea is that cats purr only when happy. Picture. Softly. A quiet room, dust motes floating, a feline resting on a sunlit sill. While purring often accompanies contentment, cats also purr when injured, ill, or stressed, as a self-soothing mechanism and a signal to conspecifics. Each slow vibration of the laryngeal muscles, each gentle breath, each subtle twitch of whiskers. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers, focusing on pleasure contexts, may generalize, softening multifunctional communication into a single emotional indicator. Imagine softly. A cat purring while stretching slowly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each measured paw adjustment, each blink, each quiet exhale. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. A quietly circulated story imagines that sharks mistake humans for seals in all attacks. Picture. Softly. An undulating ocean surface, light filtering through, a shark gliding with gentle precision. While some bites may involve misidentification, most interactions stem from curiosity, exploration, or investigatory bites rather than consistent seal confusion. Each slow fin movement, each subtle swirl of water, each measured jaw flex. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Humans, imagining predation exclusively as mistaken identity, soften investigative behavior into fearsome error. Imagine softly. A shark cruising calmly, water caressing its body, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each measured turn, each pause, each quiet ripple. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. A softly circulating idea suggests that all male seahorses give birth. Picture. Gently. A quiet seagrass meadow, sunlight drifting through the rippling water, tiny seahorses clinging delicately with their prehensile tails. In truth, only the genus Hippocampus exhibits male pregnancy in a fully developed brood pouch, where fertilized eggs develop internally until birth. Other closely related genera do not display this form of paternal gestation. Each slow beat of tiny fins, each subtle tilt of a head, each gentle sway among seagrass strands. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers, captivated by the unusual reversal of reproductive roles, may generalize broadly, softening nuanced biology into a sweeping statement. Imagine softly. A male seahorse adjusting its pouch, breathing slowly, entirely ordinary, entirely calm. The myth drifts quietly through aquariums, documentaries, and casual retellings, softening a very particular evolutionary adaptation into universal assumption. Each gentle pulse, each subtle contraction, each measured fin movement. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely serene. Another quietly persistent belief imagines that dogs' mouths are cleaner than humans. Picture. Softly. A sunlit backyard, grass brushing paws, a dog gently sniffing air, tongue flicking slowly. In reality, both dogs and humans harbor diverse oral microbiomes, with different bacteria adapted to their diets and environments. Neither mouth is inherently cleaner or more hygienic than the other. Each slow lick, each subtle jaw movement, each gentle sniff. Entirely ordinary, entirely microbiologically rich, entirely precise. Humans, observing dogs' tendency to eat and lick frequently, may project comparative cleanliness, softening complex microbial ecology into simple judgments. Imagine softly. A dog chewing a blade of grass, saliva glistening in sunlight, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each measured chew, each tongue curl, each careful swallow. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. A softly imagined story suggests polar bears hunt penguins. Picture. Gently. Drifting ice flows in the Arctic, snowflakes falling quietly, a massive polar bear gliding across frozen expanses. In truth, polar bears inhabit the northern hemisphere, while penguins live almost exclusively in the southern hemisphere, and they never meet in the wild. Each slow step, each gentle sniff of icy air, each measured paw placement. Entirely ordinary, entirely adapted, entirely precise. Humans, blending polar imagery and animal narratives, may imagine predator-prey drama that is geographically impossible, softening natural distribution into fanciful storytelling. Imagine softly. A polar bear pausing on a snow ridge, observing nothing but drifting ice, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each careful breath, each quiet shiver, each slight paw adjustment. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. A quietly circulating notion claims that owls can turn their heads 360 degrees. Picture. Softly. A shadowed forest at twilight, branches brushing in the wind, an owl perched silently on a sturdy limb. In reality, owls can rotate their heads approximately 270 degrees in either direction, aided by specialized cervical vertebrae and blood vessel adaptations. A full 360-degree rotation is anatomically impossible. Each slow pivot of the head, each measured adjustment of eyes, each gentle movement of feathers. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers, fascinated by fluid motion and sudden swivels, may exaggerate flexibility, softening anatomical specialization into mythic ability. Imagine softly. An owl tilting its head toward faint sounds, eye steady, entirely ordinary, entirely aware. Each careful turn, each subtle muscle adjustment, each quiet exhale. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. Another gently whispered story imagines that all whales sing. Picture. Softly. A deep blue ocean, currents moving gently, a whale gliding with measured grace, exhaling quietly at the surface. In truth, only some species, such as humpbacks and certain baleen whales, produce complex, prolonged songs, often related to mating or communication, while many other whale species produce simpler vocalizations or clicks. Each slow movement through water, each subtle exhalation, each ripple along the surface. Entirely ordinary, entirely communicative, entirely precise. Humans, hearing melodic whale songs in documentaries or recordings, may generalize across all species, softening selective behavior into sweeping statements. Imagine softly. A whale rising, releasing a plume of breath, notes drifting through the water, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each quiet undulation, each subtle flick of the tail, each slow pulse of sound. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. A quietly circulating idea suggests that lizards only drop their tails when grabbed. Picture. Softly. A sun-warmed rock, moss brushing gently at its edges, a small lizard perched, toes flexing against stone. In truth. While many lizards perform autotomy when physically grasped by a predator, some species may also shed their tails preemptively in response to extreme stress, chemical cues, or rapid environmental change. Each subtle contraction of muscles at the tail base, each gentle flick of the detached tail across sunlit rock, each slow adjustment of limbs. Entirely ordinary, entirely physiological, entirely precise. Humans observing sudden tail detachment may imagine strict cause and effect, softening the nuanced interplay of stress, biology, and survival into a simple story. Imagine softly. A lizard sitting quietly, tail partially extended, eyes bright yet calm, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each careful breath, each minute twitch, each deliberate orientation of body. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. The myth drifts quietly through casual observation, nature writing, and classroom anecdotes, softening a subtle defense mechanism into absolute certainty. Another softly persistent notion imagines that frogs croak only at night. Picture. Softly. A shallow pond, water reflecting gentle moonlight, reeds swaying, a frog perched atop a half-submerged stone. In reality, many species vocalize throughout the day, especially when calling mates, signaling territory, or responding to environmental cues. Each slow exhalation, each rhythmic throat expansion, each gentle ripple through water. Entirely ordinary, entirely communicative, entirely precise. Observers captivated by nocturnal choruses may overgeneralize, softening diverse behavioral patterns into a singular nighttime phenomenon. Imagine softly. A frog stretching limbs, throat pulsing with quiet notes, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each measured movement, each subtle pause, each gentle croak. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. A quietly imagined idea suggests that dolphins are always smiling. Picture. Softly. A calm ocean surface, currents brushing gently along sleek skin, a dolphin arching slowly through sunlit water. In truth, the apparent smile is an anatomical structure of the mouth, it does not reflect emotional state. Each slow turn of the head, each measured exhalation through the blowhole, each subtle flick of the fluke. Entirely ordinary, entirely anatomical, entirely precise. Observers, enchanted by the shape of the jaw, may attribute emotion where there is only form, softening structure into personality. Imagine softly. A dolphin surfacing, mouth curved, eyes scanning quietly. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each gentle wave ripple, each careful tail sweep, each small breath. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. Another quietly whispered notion claims that spiders see humans while sleeping. Picture. Softly. A dimly lit bedroom, air still, threads of cobweb glinting in quiet corners, a small spider pausing on a wall. In reality, most spiders actively avoid humans, seeking safety, insects, and shelter rather than interaction. Each slow movement of legs, each careful vibration through silk, each subtle pause before climbing. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. Humans, sensing occasional proximity, may imagine predation or curiosity, softening avoidance into intent. Imagine softly. A spider moving carefully along a beam, shadow shifting, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each measured step, each slight twitch, each quiet adjustment. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. A gently circulating myth claims all jellyfish stings are deadly. Picture. Softly. A gently drifting blue water column, sunlight refracting through soft currents, a small jellyfish pulsating slowly. In truth, most stings are mild, producing little more than transient irritation, while only a few species, such as Chironex fleckeri or irukandji, are highly dangerous. Each slow pulsation, each delicate tentacle wave, each quiet undulation through water. Entirely ordinary, entirely evolved, entirely precise. Observers, seeing occasional severe stings, may generalize across species, softening selective risk into universal fear. Imagine softly. A jellyfish floating, tentacles drifting, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each measured motion, each gentle sway, each quiet current interaction. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. Another softly imagined tale suggests that cats can survive any fall. Picture. Softly. A sunlit windowsill, dust motes drifting lazily, a cat crouched with eyes half closed. In reality, while the riding reflex helps cats orient during a fall, high falls onto hard surfaces can result in injury or death. Each subtle adjustment of paws, each gentle twist of the spine, each measured flex of claws. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Humans, observing agility and seeming luck, may exaggerate survival into invulnerability, softening risk into myth. Imagine softly. A cat leaping, twisting through the air, landing carefully, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each small landing, each flex of muscle, each quiet landing. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. A quietly circulating belief suggests that all snakes lay eggs. Picture. Softly. A sun-warmed log, leaves drifting gently, a snake coiled calmly. In truth, while many species are oviparous, some, including vipers and boas, give live birth. Each slow undulation, each subtle adjustment of coils, each measured flick of the tongue. Entirely ordinary, entirely reproductive, entirely precise. Humans, observing eggs in nests, may assume universality, softening reproductive diversity into simplicity. Imagine softly. A snake stretching, breathing, navigating the sunlit log. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each quiet movement, each subtle pause, each gentle tongue flick. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. Another gently circulating myth claims wolves howl at the full moon. Picture. Softly. A frost-kissed forest, shadows stretching across quiet snow, a wolf standing on a ridge, nose lifting to air. In truth, howling is a social communication unrelated to moon phase, used to signal territory, gather packs, or locate individuals. Each slow inhale, each measured vocalization, each subtle vibration through chest. Entirely ordinary, entirely social, entirely precise. Humans, observing silhouette against moonlight, may anthropomorphize ritual, softening communication into lunar symbolism. Imagine softly. A wolf exhaling, voice trailing gently, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each quiet howl, each pause, each measured exhale. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. A quietly persistent notion imagines sea turtles cry from sadness. Picture. Softly. A tranquil beach at dawn, waves brushing gently, a turtle lifting head, eyes adjusting to light. In reality, tears expel excess salt from the body and help maintain osmotic balance, they do not indicate emotion. Each slow blink, each gentle head lift, each measured motion of flippers. Entirely ordinary, entirely physiological, entirely precise. Humans, imagining emotion, may project feelings onto behavior, softening biological function into sentiment. Imagine softly. A turtle resting on sand, tears glinting briefly in sun, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each gentle shift, each quiet breath, each subtle flipper movement. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. A softly circulating idea whispers that pigeons are dirty disease carriers. Picture. Softly. A sunlit square, cobblestones glinting through morning mist, a pigeon pecking gently at scattered seeds. In truth, pigeons are no more disease-ridden than most wild birds, carrying only the typical microbial companions of urban wildlife. Each slow tilt of the head, each gentle flutter of wings, each measured step across stone. Entirely ordinary, entirely avian, entirely precise. Observers, noticing droppings in busy squares or feathers drifting on sidewalks, may exaggerate risk, softening everyday avian ecology into imagined hazard. Imagine softly. A pigeon preening quietly, sunlight reflecting off subtle iridescence, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each subtle wing stretch, each gentle coo, each careful pivot of claws. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. Myths drift softly through human imagination, softening normal behavior into cautionary tales, entirely harmless, entirely persistent. A quietly persistent belief suggests alligators cannot climb. Picture. Softly. A warm riverbank, water lapping gently, a juvenile alligator creeping toward a low fence. In truth, young alligators can climb low obstacles, fences, and banks with surprising agility, using claws and muscular coordination. Each measured movement, each careful positioning of limbs, each subtle flex of tail. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. Observers noticing only adults or slow-motion movements may assume incapacity, softening mobility into myth. Imagine softly. A small alligator pausing mid-climb, skin glistening, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each careful grip, each slight adjustment, each deliberate crawl. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. Myths drift softly through field guides and anecdotes, quietly persisting despite empirical observation. Another gently whispered notion suggests dogs can safely hydrate by eating snow. Picture. Softly. A winter landscape, snowflakes settling on soft fur, a dog sniffing carefully. In reality, snow provides minimal hydration and excessive ingestion can lower body temperature, even inducing mild hypothermia. Each slow lick, each measured bite, each careful sniff. Entirely ordinary, entirely canine, entirely precise. Humans observing snowy play may project safety onto novelty, softening risk into folklore. Imagine softly. A dog pausing, nose buried in snow, breath visible in cold air, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each deliberate movement, each subtle paw shift, each quiet sniff. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. A quietly circulating myth holds that koalas become intoxicated from eucalyptus leaves. Picture. Softly. A sun-dappled eucalyptus grove, leaves rustling gently, a koala chewing slowly, eyes half closed. In truth, eucalyptus is fibrous and low in nutrients. It is not intoxicating, though digestion requires specialized microbiota and slow metabolic processes. Each slow chew, each careful adjustment of limbs, each measured gaze. Entirely ordinary, entirely physiological, entirely precise. Humans observing lethargy may misinterpret low-energy behavior as drunkenness, softening biology into legend. Imagine softly. A koala clinging, chewing rhythmically, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each gentle sway, each subtle ear flick, each careful bite. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. Another gently circulating idea is that hermit crabs can safely use any shell. Picture. Softly. A tide pool, shells scattered on sand, a small crab extending claws. In truth, ill-fitting shells may impede mobility, protection, or growth, sometimes resulting in harm or death. Each slow maneuver, each careful inspection of shell interior, each measured pivot of legs. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. Humans imagining indiscriminate shell use may oversimplify complex survival strategies, softening selective behavior into casual observation. Imagine softly. A crab settling into a snug shell, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each subtle shift, each gentle adjustment, each careful exploration. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. A quietly persistent myth imagines that lobsters scream when boiled. Picture. Softly. A kitchen, water rising quietly in a pot, a lobster poised on the edge. In reality, the sound is steam escaping the shell, not vocalization. Each slow hiss, each subtle vibration, each gentle bubble. Entirely ordinary, entirely physical, entirely precise. Observers anthropomorphizing sound may imagine distress, softening thermal physics into legend. Imagine softly. A lobster submerged, shells reflecting warm water, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each quiet bubble, each gentle hiss, each soft adjustment of legs. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. Another softly circulating belief claims all bears hibernate. Picture. Softly. A dense forest, leaves brushing slowly, a bear resting in shaded undergrowth. In truth, hibernation varies by species, some remain active or enter only light torpor. Each slow exhalation, each subtle muscle relaxation, each gentle repositioning of body. Entirely ordinary, entirely physiological, entirely precise. Humans observing winter absence may overgeneralize, softening diverse behavior into uniform hibernation. Imagine softly. A bear stretching, eyes closing, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. Each measured breath, each subtle twitch, each gentle heartbeat. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. A quietly circulating notion suggests that all snakes are venomous. Picture. Softly. A sun-dappled forest floor, leaves drifting lazily, a small garter snake slithering slowly along a damp log. In reality, most snakes pose no threat to humans. Venomous species are a minority, often marked by subtle anatomical and behavioral cues. Each gentle movement, each slow flick of the tongue, each measured coil of body. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers, noting the occasional bite from a venomous species, may generalize danger, softening varied biology into uniform peril. Imagine softly. A snake pausing to sense the air, tongue flicking delicately, muscles flexing just enough to move without effort. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely serene. Human imagination drifts, weaving tales of universal venom, exaggerating what is rare into the everyday. Each small scale, each slow ripple along the spine, each gentle adjustment to terrain. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. Snakes, whether harmless or venomous, exist quietly, persistently, rhythmically, following patterns of predation, camouflage, and survival. Entirely unremarkable in their everyday existence, yet endlessly fascinating to the observant eye, softly reminding us that danger and peace coexist in gentle balance. Another quietly circulating misconception imagines whales spout water from their blowholes. Picture. Softly. A calm ocean, ripples barely disturbing the sunlit surface, a humpback lifting gently. In truth, whales exhale air and water vapor, the visible spray caused by condensation of warm breath meeting cool air, not by drawing water up into their lungs. Each measured exhalation, each slow rise and fall of the body, each gentle ripple of water around pectoral fins. Entirely ordinary, entirely physiological, entirely precise. Observers, noticing the dramatic plume, may imagine literal water ejection, softening respiratory mechanics into spectacle. Imagine softly. A whale resting at the surface, breath visible as mist, body drifting slightly. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely serene. Each slow movement, each gentle exhale, each soft adjustment to waves. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely calm. Human storytelling amplifies visual impression, converting simple biology into imagined drama, entirely harmless, entirely persistent, entirely unremarkable yet quietly mesmerizing in its ordinary complexity. A gently circulating idea suggests butterflies taste with their tongues. Picture. Softly. A meadow of wildflowers, petals brushing in slow breezes, a monarch landing delicately. In reality, butterflies detect flavor and chemical composition through specialized sensors on their feet, contacting surfaces to determine whether nectar is suitable. Each gentle probe, each slow movement along a flower, each subtle flex of tarsal segments. Entirely ordinary, entirely sensory, entirely precise. Observers, fascinated by the coiled proboscis, may assume direct tasting through the tongue, softening specialized physiology into simplified imagination. Imagine softly. A butterfly pausing, antennae drifting lightly in the breeze, tarsal sensors pressed gently, probing the flower. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely serene. Each slow movement, each delicate flutter, each quiet moment of contact. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely fascinating in its soft, precise biology, drifting gently through observation and myth alike, entirely harmless, entirely persistent, entirely unnoticed in everyday life. Another softly persistent belief holds that dolphins never sleep. Picture. Softly. An endless stretch of cerulean ocean, a bottlenose moving slowly just beneath the surface. In truth, dolphins rest one hemisphere of their brain at a time, allowing the other hemisphere to maintain breathing and environmental awareness. Each gentle glide, each subtle fin adjustment, each measured blink. Entirely ordinary, entirely neurological, entirely precise. Observers, noting constant motion at the surface, may imagine sleeplessness, softening specialized adaptation into dramatic impossibility. Imagine softly. A dolphin drifting near a school of fish, one eye closed, the other alert. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely serene. Each measured stroke, each rhythmic exhalation, each slow interplay with currents. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely elegant in its biological simplicity, quietly drifting through imagination and observation alike, persistent yet harmless. A quietly circulating notion suggests that all moths eat clothing. Picture. Softly. A dimly lit closet, garments resting on hangers, a small insect pausing on wool. In reality, only the larvae of a few species consume keratin-containing fibers, most moths feed on nectar or plant matter. Each slow crawl of larvae, each delicate probing of fabric, each gentle rotation of body segments. Entirely ordinary, entirely ecological, entirely precise. Observers, noting occasional damage, may generalize behavior to all moths, softening specialized feeding into universal wardrobe threat. Imagine softly. A larva nestled gently, digesting quietly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely unremarkable. Drifting through human imagination as myth and biology intertwine. Each slow chew, each subtle movement, each soft pause. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely persistent in its quiet, unnoticed way, perfectly harmless. A quietly persistent belief suggests that tarantulas can jump long distances. Picture. Softly. A shadowed forest floor, leaves drifting slowly, a large spider paused near a mossy rock, legs flexing ever so slightly. In reality, tarantulas are poor jumpers, relying primarily on slow, deliberate movement across the substrate. Attempting leaps can result in injury due to their heavy, fragile exoskeletons. Each measured step, each subtle flex of tarsal claws, each gentle adjustment of pedipalps. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may see sudden lunges or glimpses of movement and imagine spectacular leaps, softening cautious locomotion into imagined athleticism. Imagine softly. A tarantula resting, legs splayed, breathing quietly, antennae-like seedy twitching gently. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely unhurried. Myths drift. Magnifying risk and exaggerating agility, turning careful, cautious arachnids into imagined acrobats. Each slow reposition, each subtle touch of substrate, each quiet pause. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely benign, following rhythms of hunting, climbing, and subtle exploration. Entirely unnoticed, entirely precise, entirely persistent in their quiet survival. Observers may marvel, imagining leaps that rarely occur, softening meticulous reality into storybook imagination, entirely harmless, entirely persistent, entirely ordinary. Tarantulas, with all their delicate precision, move quietly and slowly, adhering to their natural rhythms, entirely unremarkable yet endlessly fascinating in the almost imperceptible details of their terrestrial navigation, softly reminding us that small creatures hold secrets of subtlety often overlooked. A quietly exaggerated notion suggests that all frogs live in water. Picture. Softly. A misty woodland floor, dew clinging to leaves, a small frog poised on a mossy stone, breathing slowly. In reality, many frog species are entirely terrestrial, living in leaf litter, under logs, or high in forest canopies, interacting with moist environments but rarely entering bodies of water except for reproduction. Each subtle hop, each careful placement of webbed toes, each gentle stretch of limbs. Entirely ordinary, entirely ecological, entirely precise. Observers may see aquatic species and generalize, imagining all frogs as waterbound, softening diverse life histories into a single watery stereotype. Imagine softly. A frog moving cautiously through damp undergrowth, skin glistening, muscles contracting and relaxing gently. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Each slow movement, each careful pause, each quiet observation. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. The myth drifts. Transforming varied habitat use into simplistic aquatic imagery, gently exaggerating behavior while overlooking terrestrial subtlety. Frogs, terrestrial or semi-aquatic, interact with their environment delicately and quietly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely unnoticed in their soft, precise daily rhythms. A quietly persistent idea suggests that octopuses live for decades. Picture. Softly. A quiet coral reef, water shimmering, an octopus tentacle drifting lazily along a rock. In reality, most species live only 1 to 3 years, with some larger species reaching 5 or 6, and their life cycle tightly linked to growth, reproduction, and senescence. Each gentle undulation of tentacles, each subtle adjustment of suckers, each slow shift of chromatophores. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. Observers, noticing intelligence and dexterity, may imagine longevity akin to mammals, softening short, intricate lives into imagined decades. Imagine softly. An octopus exploring crevices, breathing slowly, skin subtly changing color. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Each calculated movement, each quiet pause, each deliberate reach. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely persistent in its soft ecological choreography. Myths drift. Imagining long-lived intelligence, gently magnifying ephemeral existence into imagined decades of activity, entirely harmless, entirely persistent, entirely ordinary. Octopuses move and interact with remarkable precision, entirely unhurried, entirely unnoticed, entirely alive, softly reminding us that even short lives are filled with subtle, exquisite detail. A gently circulating notion suggests that all snakes constrict prey to crush bones. Picture. Softly. A sun-dappled forest floor, a snake coiled around a small rodent, muscles contracting ever so slightly. In truth, constriction slows circulation and breathing, subduing prey, rather than physically crushing bones. The process is precise and methodical. Each slow muscular ripple, each subtle tightening, each measured adjustment of body coils. Entirely ordinary, entirely functional, entirely precise. Observers may imagine bone-crushing power, softening delicate physiological mechanics into dramatic spectacle. Imagine softly. A snake breathing calmly, body rhythmically pressing, prey held carefully yet gently. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Each gentle ripple, each quiet pause, each subtle release. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. Myths drift. Exaggerating danger, softening elegant predatory mechanics into cinematic imagery. Snakes, through measured constriction, achieve balance between survival and delicacy, entirely unnoticed, entirely ordinary, entirely persistent in quiet natural rhythm, softly reminding us that what is extraordinary in imagination is often ordinary in biology. A quietly exaggerated belief suggests that cows have 4 stomachs. Picture. Softly. A sunlit pasture, tall grass brushing the underbelly of a gentle cow, who's resting quietly. In reality, cows have a single stomach with 4 specialized chambers, rumen, reticulum, omasum, and abomasum, working sequentially to digest fibrous plant material efficiently. Each slow rumination, each subtle regurgitation of cud, each measured swallowing motion. Entirely ordinary, entirely physiological, entirely precise. Observers, noticing complex digestion, may generalize to 4 stomachs, softening intricate anatomy into simple multiplicity. Imagine softly. A cow chewing rhythmically, eyes half closed, muscles coordinating each motion. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Each gentle contraction, each slow peristaltic wave, each subtle microbial interaction. Entirely ordinary, entirely functional, entirely precise. The myth drifts. Simplifying complexity, softening specialized digestive anatomy into casual misconception. Cows, quietly processing cellulose, operate in patient, deliberate patterns, entirely unnoticed, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, softly reminding us that sophisticated physiology often hides in plain sight, persistently ordinary yet endlessly precise. A quietly persistent idea suggests that all birds migrate. Picture. Softly. A quiet woodland canopy, leaves barely rustling, a small bird perched on a branch, wings folded, feathers ruffling gently in the breeze. In reality, many species are non-migratory, remaining in their native range year-round, with movements dictated by local resources and ecological conditions. Each gentle preening, each slow wing adjustment, each measured hop along a branch. Entirely ordinary, entirely ecological, entirely precise. Observers may imagine all birds embarking on long migrations, softening stationary life histories into imagined flights. Imagine softly. A bird resting among moss, eyes slowly blinking, feathers shifting slightly with each breath. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Each subtle movement, each quiet pause, each gentle interaction with environment. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. The myth drifts. Exaggerating mobility, softening local residence into generalized flight, entirely harmless, entirely persistent, entirely ordinary. Birds, migratory or resident, exist quietly, rhythmically, precisely. Softly reminding us that patterns of movement are varied, unnoticed, and quietly elegant in their everyday ordinariness. A quietly whispered idea drifts through human imagination. That hippos are slow, lumbering giants incapable of haste. Picture. Softly. A sunlit riverbank, water rippling over mud, a large hippo resting half submerged, eyes blinking slowly, nostrils flaring in gentle rhythm. In reality, hippos can reach speeds of nearly 19 miles per hour over short distances on land, easily outrunning an average human, though only in brief bursts before fatigue sets in. Each measured paw placement, each subtle flex of massive limbs, each gentle movement of the jaw while grazing. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers, noting their size and calm demeanor in water, may imagine lethargy as a permanent state, softening formidable capability into imagined slowness. Imagine softly. A hippo stepping onto soft grass, muscles tensing and relaxing quietly, movement coordinated yet unexpectedly swift. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely alive. The myth drifts. Exaggerating apparent lethargy while ignoring bursts of remarkable speed, gently transforming real physiology into imagined spectacle. Each careful motion, each slow turn of the head, each gentle sway in the current. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise, quietly reminding us that what appears ponderous may conceal latent agility. Hippos, in measured bursts, display both calm patience and surprising mobility, entirely unnoticed, entirely ordinary, entirely persistent in their soft, precise rhythms of life along rivers and floodplains, softly illustrating that immense size and quiet grace do not preclude sudden movement. Another gently circulating notion imagines that cats are nocturnal. Picture. Softly. A twilight-lit room, shadows stretching across worn wooden floorboards, a domestic cat crouched on a windowsill, tail flicking ever so slightly. Domestic cats are actually crepuscular, most active at dawn and dusk, gently exploring their environment during low-light hours. Each slow stretch, each careful step, each subtle flick of the ears. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may notice late-night activity and generalize, softening nuanced behavioral patterns into broad nocturnal assumptions. Imagine softly. Whiskers brushing the edge of a windowsill, paws touching lightly on carpet, eyes blinking slowly in dim light. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Each careful hop, each gentle pounce on an imagined insect, each subtle reposition of tail. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. Myths drift. Simplifying complex behavior into convenient generalizations, quietly transforming subtle activity rhythms into imagined nighttime obsession. Cats, crepuscular and attentive, move softly through familiar spaces, entirely unnoticed, entirely ordinary, entirely precise, softly reminding us that patterns of activity are as subtle as shadows moving across the floor, entirely harmless, entirely persistent, entirely alive. A softly repeated belief holds that dogs can only pant to cool down. Picture. Softly. A sun-drenched garden, a golden retriever lying in patchy shade, tongue lolling slowly, chest rising and falling rhythmically. While panting is primary, dogs also release heat through sweat glands located in paw pads, which provide subtle, supplementary cooling. Each slow step, each gentle lift of a paw, each measured flex of toe pads. Entirely ordinary, entirely functional, entirely precise. Observers may exaggerate panting as the sole cooling mechanism, softening nuanced thermoregulation into simplicity. Imagine softly. Pads pressing on warm stone, tiny sweat droplets forming imperceptibly, breathing synchronized with body movement. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely alive. Each subtle adjustment, each quiet shift of weight, each gentle pause in motion. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely unnoticed. Myths drift. Emphasizing one cooling behavior while overlooking delicate supplementary methods, quietly simplifying sophisticated physiology. Dogs, through panting and paw-pad sweat, manage thermal balance gracefully, entirely unnoticed, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, softly reminding us that even ordinary gestures hold quiet, essential precision in life's rhythms. A quietly circulated notion imagines all toads are poisonous. Picture. Softly. A damp forest floor, moss cushioning a small toad, limbs tucked, eyes blinking slowly in gentle observation. In reality, some species secrete mild toxins, while others are harmless to humans, relying on camouflage rather than chemical defense. Each subtle movement, each careful placement of a foot, each slow turn of the head. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may generalize chemical defense as universal, softening species-specific biology into exaggerated danger. Imagine softly. A toad breathing slowly, skin glistening with dew, eyes surveying leaves above. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing toxicity while ignoring harmlessness, gently magnifying risk and imagination. Each quiet hop, each measured pause, each subtle posture. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. Toads, chemical or plain, move delicately and persistently, entirely unnoticed, entirely ordinary, softly reminding us that generalized assumptions often overlook subtle variation in nature. Another gently persistent idea is that rattlesnakes always rattle before striking. Picture. Softly. A sun-dappled desert, sand warming beneath scales, a rattlesnake coiled beneath a sparse shrub, tail still. In reality, rattlesnakes may strike without warning when startled, relying on camouflage and sudden motion, using the rattle primarily as a deterrent in certain contexts. Each slow flick of the tongue, each subtle vibration of muscles, each careful adjustment of body coils. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may imagine ritualized warning sounds as universal, softening sudden predatory behavior into predictable performance. Imagine softly. A snake holding still, scales glinting in sunlight, eyes measuring distance. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Exaggerating caution signals while ignoring variability in behavior, quietly transforming nuance to defensive strategy into imagined uniformity. Each subtle pause, each quiet twitch, each slow reposition. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. Rattlesnakes, patient and poised, operate quietly in their environment, entirely unnoticed, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, softly reminding us that warning signals are flexible, context-dependent, and gently precise. A softly repeated misconception imagines that sea stars are fish. Picture. Softly. A tide pool, water barely moving, a star-shaped creature resting against smooth rock, 2 feet clinging slowly to the surface. In reality, sea stars are echinoderms, marine invertebrates with radial symmetry and no backbone, entirely unrelated to fish, with unique water vascular systems enabling locomotion and feeding. Each slow extension of tube feet, each gentle suction, each quiet adjustment of arm. Entirely ordinary, entirely functional, entirely alive. Observers, seeing aquatic motion, may generalize vertebrate classification, softening taxonomy into simple aquatic grouping. Imagine softly. The starfish flexing slightly, breathing through its thin epidermis, color shifting subtly. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Simplifying classification while ignoring anatomical distinctiveness, quietly transforming echinoderms into imagined vertebrates. Each slow movement, each gentle pulse of water through the vascular system, each minor adjustment to current. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely unnoticed. Sea stars, echinodermal and delicate, persist quietly on rocks, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, softly reminding us that biological classification is subtle, precise, and endlessly patient. A gently circulating belief whispers that fish cannot drown. Picture. Softly. A placid pond, water reflecting muted sunlight, a small perch hovering lazily among reeds. In truth, fish require oxygen, extracted from water through delicate gill filaments, and can suffocate if oxygen levels drop too low or if gills are damaged. Each subtle opening and closing of the mouth, each delicate movement of gill covers, each slow adjustment of fins. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may assume that living in water automatically prevents oxygen deprivation, softening nuanced physiology into blanket assumption. Imagine softly. A fish hovering near the surface, water currents brushing its scales, oxygen diffusing through lamella. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. The myth drifts. Magnifying water as inherently protective while ignoring physiological dependency. Each gentle flick of a fin, each minor tilt of the body, each slow swirl through suspended silt. Entirely ordinary, entirely functional, entirely precise. Fish, living amid oxygen gradients and constantly adjusting respiration, exhibit quiet survival strategies unnoticed by most. Their existence is a subtle negotiation with environmental oxygen, entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely persistent, reminding us that being submerged is not equivalent to being immune to suffocation. Observing this, one may appreciate the slow, delicate balance of aquatic life, each breath an almost imperceptible miracle of exchange, entirely unnoticed, entirely alive, entirely precise. Another softly circulated idea imagines that camels primarily spit as a defense. Picture. Softly. A sun-baked desert, sand shimmering with heat, a camel lifting its long head, nostrils flaring slowly. In reality, camels rely on biting and kicking more often than spitting when confronted by threats, though spitting is sometimes employed, mainly as a mild deterrent. Each measured shift of weight, each careful lift of a forefoot, each subtle curl of lips. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may be captivated by the dramatic spectacle of expelled contents, softening nuanced behavioral repertoire into a singular, exaggerated defensive act. Imagine softly. The camel settling its bulk, chewing slowly, eyes blinking under long lashes, tail swishing gently. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing the most visually striking behavior while overlooking common, practical strategies of biting and kicking. Each subtle step, each minor reposition, each slow blink. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Camels, patient and deliberate, deploy defense in context-dependent ways, entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely persistent, quietly reminding us that dramatic gestures often overshadow practical action. Their behavior, layered and intentional, unfolds quietly in desert light, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely unnoticed, as the rhythms of survival continue, measured and exact. A quietly persistent notion imagines that all bees produce honey. Picture. Softly. A wildflower meadow, sunlight filtering through leaves, a bee settling lightly on a blossom, proboscis dipping into nectar. In reality, only certain species, such as honeybees, make surplus honey that humans can harvest. Most bees collect nectar solely to nourish themselves and their brood. Each subtle extension of the tongue, each gentle vibration of wings, each measured deposition of nectar into cells. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may generalize honey making as universal, softening species-specific behavior into an appealing simplification. Imagine softly. A bee retreating into a leaf shelter, pollen grains clinging to delicate hairs, legs moving rhythmically. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing a product valuable to humans while neglecting the majority of species' silent, unobserved routines. Each careful flight, each slow landing, each minute transfer of nectar. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Bees, diverse and meticulous, construct their lives in small, precise increments, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, quietly negotiating with flowers and the environment, reminding us that abundance is selective, yet the precision of effort is universal, entirely ordinary, entirely persistent. A quietly drifting belief suggests dolphins mate for life. Picture. Softly. A gentle sea swell, turquoise light refracting beneath rolling waves, a dolphin arching through water. In reality, dolphins form multiple pair bonds throughout life, social and mating behaviors fluid and context-dependent, shaped by pods and community interactions. Each subtle flick of a tail, each quiet twist of the body, each gentle exhalation through the blowhole. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may anthropomorphize relationships, softening complex social structures into romanticized permanence. Imagine softly. A dolphin sliding alongside companions, skin glistening, eye movements synchronized subtly with others. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing enduring pair bonds while ignoring broader social networks. Each coordinated leap, each measured glide, each quiet echo of communication. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Dolphins, fluid and social, navigate connections with gentle precision, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that relationships are dynamic, not fixed, quietly measured in ripples and movements, entirely unremarkable yet entirely exact. Another softly imagined notion holds that all penguins slide on their bellies purely for amusement. Picture. Softly. A snow-dusted incline, sunlight reflecting off icy surfaces, a penguin lowering itself, body touching ice. In truth, sliding, or tobogganing, is primarily an energy-conserving method of locomotion or a strategy to avoid predators, though enjoyment may accompany it. Each gentle shift of weight, each precise push with flippers, each subtle flex of body. Entirely ordinary, entirely functional, entirely alive. Observers may exaggerate pleasure, softening strategic movement into playful behavior. Imagine softly. A penguin gliding, feathers pressed to ice, legs tucked, eyes scanning slowly. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Embellishing fun while overlooking efficiency. Each controlled slide, each measured deceleration, each delicate lift onto feet. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Penguins, methodical and precise, navigate icy terrain efficiently, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that functionality can appear as play, quietly measured in gentle motions across frozen landscapes. A quietly circulated belief imagines that owls hunt only at night. Picture. Softly. A dense woodland, moonlight filtering through leaves, an owl perched quietly on a branch. In reality, some species are diurnal or crepuscular, hunting by day or at dawn and dusk, depending on prey and environmental conditions. Each slow rotation of the head, each subtle tilt of eyes, each careful adjustment of talons. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers, noting nocturnal activity, may generalize, softening diverse hunting strategies into night-only myth. Imagine softly. Feathers rustling, talons gripping bark, eyes tracking small movement. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Simplifying hunting patterns, quietly overlooking adaptability. Each deliberate swoop, each gentle flap, each measured landing. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Owls, patient and perceptive, operate quietly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that activity patterns are subtle, flexible, and quietly measured. A softly persistent notion imagines hedgehogs carry food on their spines. Picture. Softly. A mossy undergrowth, twigs brushing gently, a hedgehog sniffing near a berry, body low to the earth. In reality, spines function as defense against predators, food is not carried atop them, though the hedgehog may manipulate small morsels with its mouth and paws. Each cautious step, each delicate nose twitch, each subtle paw motion. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may misinterpret exploratory handling as carriage, softening defensive adaptation into imagined transport. Imagine softly. A hedgehog curling slightly, senses alert, spines shifting imperceptibly. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Embellishing posture and movement into fanciful behavior. Each sniff, each nibble, each tiny adjustment. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Hedgehogs, cautious and precise, navigate food and threat landscapes subtly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that appearance can mislead without careful observation. Another gently circulating belief holds that all sharks give live birth. Picture. Softly. A shallow, sun-dappled reef, a small shark gliding over sand. In truth, reproductive modes vary. Some species are oviparous, laying eggs, while others are ovoviviparous or viviparous, carrying young internally. Each slow movement of fins, each subtle adjustment of position, each measured exploration of terrain. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may assume uniform reproduction, softening diverse biological strategies into blanket assumption. Imagine softly. A shark gliding, gills moving rhythmically, eyes scanning gently. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Simplifying reproduction, quietly overlooking ecological diversity. Each deliberate fin flick, each subtle turn, each quiet pause. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Sharks, varied and precise, navigate reproduction with quiet exactness, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that life strategies are nuanced, carefully balanced, and softly orchestrated. A quietly circulating idea suggests that rats are filthy. Picture. Softly. A dimly lit barn corner, straw shifting under delicate paws, a small rat cleaning itself slowly. In truth, rats devote a significant portion of each day to grooming, maintaining fur hygiene and social cleanliness, entirely meticulous and precise. Each subtle lick, each gentle paw stroke, each delicate shake of the head. Entirely ordinary, entirely functional, entirely alive. Observers may generalize urban encounters as proof of filth, softening diligent maintenance into imagined dirtiness. Imagine softly. A rat pausing, whiskers twitching, eyes blinking slowly, tail curling lightly. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing occasional unsanitary contexts while ignoring routine hygiene. Each careful lick, each measured paw placement, each subtle stretch. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely unnoticed. Rats, meticulous and exact, maintain fur and social cleanliness with quiet diligence, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that careful habits are invisible but essential. A quietly persistent belief imagines that elephants possess perfect memory. Picture. Softly. A misty savanna, grass swaying slowly under the sun's gentle warmth, a large elephant stepping deliberately among scattered acacia trees. Observers note their remarkable recollection of waterholes, routes, and social companions, imagining an infallible mind capable of storing every detail. In truth, elephant memory is extraordinary, particularly for social relationships and environmental locations, yet it is not flawless. Errors and forgetfulness occur, especially with time or stress. Each slow lift of the trunk, each subtle pivot of a foot, each gentle flap of an ear. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers anthropomorphize, softening nuanced cognition into mythic perfection. Imagine softly. A matriarch elephant pausing, trunk tracing familiar terrain, eyes flicking toward distant companions, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Amplifying selective observations, overlooking the complexity and limitations of memory systems. Each measured step, each deliberate sniff, each minor adjustment of posture. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Elephants' memories, shaped by necessity and experience, are remarkable yet imperfect, quietly balancing survival, social cohesion, and learning. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that even the most capable minds are not infallible. Another softly circulating notion suggests rabbits love carrots as a staple. Picture. Softly. A shaded garden, soil rich, leaves trembling in a light breeze, a small rabbit nibbling carefully. In truth, while rabbits enjoy carrots, excessive consumption can cause health issues, particularly imbalances in calcium or sugar intake. Each delicate bite, each measured chew, each subtle flick of whiskers. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may imagine constant carrot consumption, softening nuanced dietary requirements into simple indulgence. Imagine softly. A rabbit pausing, ears twitching, nose quivering, surveying the surroundings. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing appealing vegetables while overlooking nutritional balance. Each careful nibble, each slow shift of weight, each gentle adjustment of posture. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Rabbits, selective and cautious eaters, balance dietary needs against opportunity and safety, entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that preference does not equal necessity. A quietly whispered idea holds that all crocodiles inhabit tropical regions. Picture. Softly. A sun-dappled riverbank, water lapping lazily, a crocodile lying partially submerged. In reality, while most species prefer tropical climates, some inhabit temperate regions, adapting to cooler waters and seasonal shifts. Each subtle twitch of the tail, each careful adjustment of limbs, each slow blink. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely alive. Observers generalize geographic distribution, softening flexible habitat tolerance into rigid assumption. Imagine softly. A crocodile moving deliberately through murky water, nostrils just above the surface, body shifting imperceptibly. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing warmth and latitude while neglecting ecological plasticity. Each measured breath, each subtle reposition, each gentle movement. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely unnoticed. Crocodiles navigate varied habitats with patience and caution, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that geography does not fully determine lifestyle. Another softly circulating notion imagines that all dolphins are always friendly to each other. Picture. Softly. A shimmering bay, sunlight reflecting off gentle waves, a pair of dolphins gliding alongside one another. In truth, dolphins can be aggressive, even to conspecifics, occasionally inflicting harm on calves or rivals. Each slow arch of the body, each subtle flick of fins, each measured exhalation through the blowhole. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers romanticize social bonds, softening occasional violence into universal friendliness. Imagine softly. A pod moving cohesively, minor skirmishes imperceptible beneath synchronized movements. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing cooperative interactions while overlooking nuanced hierarchies. Each coordinated leap, each subtle nudge, each gentle contact. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Dolphins' social behaviors are complex, blending cooperation and competition, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that friendship is contextual, fluid, and measured over time. A gently circulated belief suggests that penguins only live in Antarctica. Picture. Softly. A rocky coastline, sea mist rising, a penguin waddling carefully among small stones. In reality, penguins inhabit various southern hemisphere regions, from subantarctic islands to temperate coasts, adjusting to diverse climates. Each subtle pivot, each careful hop, each slow preening motion. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely alive. Observers often generalize icy habitats, softening distributional diversity into a single environment. Imagine softly. A penguin pausing, eyes scanning the horizon, body moving with deliberate balance. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing icy images for narrative simplicity. Each measured step, each gentle shake of feathers, each quiet interaction with conspecifics. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely unnoticed. Penguins, adaptable and precise, inhabit varied regions while maintaining characteristic behaviors, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that species identity is not bound to a single landscape. Another softly persistent idea imagines that all monkeys have tails. Picture. Softly. A dense forest canopy, light dappled through leaves, a monkey balancing carefully along a branch. In truth, apes and some monkeys lack tails, demonstrating evolutionary diversity. Each slow reach, each careful grip, each subtle shift of weight. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers generalize physical traits, softening variation into expectation. Imagine softly. A tailless ape moving deliberately, muscles flexing subtly, eyes observing. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing tails as defining traits while overlooking exceptions. Each measured movement, each gentle pause, each slow adjustment. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Monkeys and apes demonstrate varied morphology with precision, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that evolutionary diversity manifests in subtle forms. A quietly whispered notion suggests that tortoises cannot swim. Picture. Softly. A calm pond, lilies floating lightly, a tortoise lowering itself into water. In reality, some species are competent swimmers, moving limbs slowly and deliberately to navigate aquatic environments. Each subtle stroke, each careful rotation, each gentle adjustment of head and neck. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely alive. Observers may generalize terrestrial habits, softening aquatic capacity into impossibility. Imagine softly. A tortoise gliding near the surface, bubbles rising imperceptibly, limbs moving with quiet precision. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. emphasizing terrestrial lifestyle while neglecting occasional swimming behavior. Each slow propulsion, each measured pause, each gentle repositioning. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely unnoticed. Tortoises, patient and adaptable, navigate land and water with quiet deliberation, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that mobility is context-dependent and subtly varied. Another softly circulating belief imagines that all bees die in winter. Picture. Softly. A hive tucked under branches, bees clustering tightly, bodies pressing gently together. In reality, honeybee colonies survive winter through huddling and thermoregulation, maintaining activity to sustain the queen and brood. Each subtle shift of position, each measured vibration to generate warmth, each slow adjustment of the cluster. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely alive. Observers may generalize individual lifespans, softening colony survival into imagined mortality. Imagine softly. Bees breathing together, wings resting lightly, temperature maintained through coordinated effort. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing visible absence of foraging, overlooking internal activity. Each delicate movement, each subtle repositioning, each gentle shift of energy. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely unnoticed. Bees, communal and meticulous, endure winter collectively, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that survival often occurs quietly within structured communities. A quietly persistent notion imagines that fish have only a 3-second memory. Picture. Softly. A sunlit aquarium, water refracting slowly, a small fish pausing near a rock. In reality, many fish demonstrate long-term memory, recalling feeding routines, territorial boundaries, and environmental cues over extended periods. Each slow fin adjustment, each subtle head turn, each gentle navigation of obstacles. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may underestimate cognitive capacity, softening complex memory into ephemeral perception. Imagine softly. A fish gliding deliberately, eyes tracking movement, body responding with measured subtlety. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing short-term observation while ignoring repeated behaviors demonstrating memory. Each measured swim, each gentle pause, each slow correction in trajectory. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Fish, thoughtful and precise, navigate environments informed by memory, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that cognition is subtle, continuous, and quietly effective. A persistent belief drifts through contemporary thought, imagining that horses cannot vomit. Picture. Softly. A sunlit pasture, grass swaying lazily, a horse lifting its head to chew, nostrils flaring ever so gently. In truth, most horses are anatomically unable to regurgitate due to a powerful cardiac sphincter at the base of the esophagus, yet under extreme medical conditions or intense gastrointestinal distress, rare regurgitation can occur. Each slow chew, each subtle shift of weight, each gentle flick of the tail. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may assume absolute incapacity, softening nuanced physiology into rigid certainty. Imagine softly. The horse breathing deeply, muscles flexing slowly, ears pivoting with measured attentiveness. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing absence of observable regurgitation, overlooking occasional exceptional occurrences. Each deliberate step, each minor adjustment of posture, each careful alignment of hooves. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. The digestive system, precise yet limited, functions continuously in a delicate balance, quietly reminding us that biology is rarely absolute, entirely ordinary, entirely persistent, entirely alive. Another gently circulating notion suggests that all foxes are nocturnal. Picture. Softly. A forest edge, dappled light filtering through leaves, a fox pausing to sniff the air, paws resting lightly on soft soil. In reality, foxes are crepuscular, meaning active at dawn and dusk, but many species demonstrate flexible activity patterns, foraging both day and night. Each slow head turn, each subtle adjustment of the ears, each measured breath. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely alive. Observers may generalize nocturnality from limited sightings, softening flexible behavior into simplified expectation. Imagine softly. A fox padding cautiously along a fallen log, tail sweeping the ground, eyes attentive. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing nighttime activity while neglecting adaptive variability. Each careful sniff, each deliberate step, each gentle crouch. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely unnoticed. Foxes navigate environments with measured timing and quiet attentiveness, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that activity patterns are subtly negotiated. A quietly whispered idea imagines that all sharks are dangerous to humans. Picture. Softly. A sunlit ocean expanse, light refracting through gentle waves, a shadow gliding beneath the surface. In truth, most shark species avoid humans entirely, interactions are rare, and attacks are usually cases of curiosity or mistaken identity. Each slow undulation, each measured fin adjustment, each subtle shift of body. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers magnify size and teeth, softening avoidance behaviors into imagined threat. Imagine softly. A reef shark gliding past coral, eyes scanning the surroundings, movements deliberate. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing danger while overlooking nuance. Each subtle rotation, each measured propulsion, each gentle glide. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Sharks, cautious and precise, navigate complex habitats with quiet intent, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that presence does not equal peril. Another gently circulating notion is that dolphins are always intelligent problem solvers. Picture. Softly. A calm bay, sun shimmering, a dolphin surfacing slowly, exhaling with gentle rhythm. In reality, intelligence varies widely among individuals, and problem-solving abilities differ according to experience, context, and social learning. Each slow flick of the tail, each measured rise of the head, each subtle change in posture. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely alive. Observers may generalize clever behavior from selected examples, softening nuanced cognition into uniformity. Imagine softly. A pod gliding through gentle currents, minor variations in movement and interaction barely noticeable. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing universal cleverness while overlooking individual differences. Each careful surfacing, each subtle fin flick, each measured exhalation. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely unnoticed. Dolphins exhibit thoughtful behavior, yet individuality prevails quietly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that intelligence is nuanced, situational, and quietly effective. Another softly whispered belief imagines that all owls hoot. Picture. Softly. A moonlit forest, leaves trembling gently, an owl perched silently on a branch, feathers ruffling in a slow breeze. In truth, some species make screeches, whistles, or barks instead of hoots, each vocalization suited to environment and communication needs. each slow turn of the head, each measured blink, each subtle shift of weight. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may generalize hooting as universal, softening acoustic diversity into expectation. Imagine softly. An owl listening carefully, throat muscles adjusting minutely, eyes reflecting pale light. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing hoots while neglecting variety in calls. Each careful pivot, each gentle movement of feathers, each subtle adjustment in posture. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Owls communicate with nuanced vocal patterns, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that even silence carries complexity. A quietly persistent notion imagines that chimpanzees are peaceful. Picture. Softly. A dense forest canopy, dappled sunlight, a chimpanzee resting slowly on a branch, eyes tracking subtle movements. In reality, chimpanzees can be territorial and occasionally violent, particularly in defense of resources or social hierarchies. Each slow adjustment, each subtle shift in muscles, each measured glance. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely alive. Observers may romanticize social bonds, softening occasional aggression into mythic calm. Imagine softly. A group moving slowly through underbrush, interactions measured, gestures subtle. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing gentle tendencies while overlooking complex social dynamics. Each careful movement, each minor vocalization, each delicate hand motion. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely unnoticed. Chimpanzees navigate society with nuanced behavior, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that peace and tension coexist subtly in social life. Another softly whispered belief suggests all turtles are slow. Picture. Softly. A sun-warmed rock beside a quiet pond, a turtle lifting its head slowly, legs moving deliberately. In truth, some species move quickly, both on land and in water, depending on context, environment, or predation risk. Each measured step, each subtle shift of weight, each careful limb extension. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may generalize apparent sluggishness, softening adaptable movement into absolute slowness. Imagine softly. A turtle gliding through water, currents brushing the shell, eyes attentive. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing slow perception while overlooking situational agility. Each gentle adjustment, each subtle propulsion, each careful positioning. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Turtles navigate complex terrain with quiet deliberation, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that speed is context-dependent and nuanced. A quietly circulating idea imagines that crocodiles never stop growing. Picture. Softly. A sunlit riverbank, water shimmering, a crocodile basking with slow, deliberate movements. In reality, growth slows greatly with age and environmental factors, eventually reaching near stable adult size. Each subtle twitch of the tail, each gentle rise of the body, each measured adjustment of limbs. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely alive. Observers may imagine indefinite growth, softening biological limits into myth. Imagine softly. A crocodile lowering itself into the water, nostrils barely breaking the surface, muscles flexing subtly. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing relentless size while overlooking physiological constraints. Each careful submersion, each measured breath, each gentle reposition. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely unnoticed. Crocodiles balance growth and environment quietly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that even formidable creatures adhere to biological limits. A quietly circulating idea imagines that all whales eat fish. Picture. Softly. An immense, sun-dappled ocean, currents moving slowly, a whale gliding gracefully beneath the surface, its massive body displacing water in gentle, rhythmic arcs. In reality, some whales, like blue whales or humpback whales, feed primarily on tiny plankton or krill, filtering hundreds of kilograms of these minuscule organisms through baleen plates in a single day, rather than hunting fish at all. Each slow sweep of the tail, each subtle expansion of the throat pouch, each delicate opening and closing of the baleen plates. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may imagine the largest of creatures constantly hunting familiar prey, softening diverse feeding strategies into a simplified image. Imagine softly the whale drifting through a sun-streaked current, tiny particles of food moving past its mouth, the water murmuring faintly around it. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift, emphasizing predation while overlooking nuanced dietary specialization. Each measured rise to the surface, each gentle exhalation, each slow descent. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Whales, quietly patient and precise, feed according to evolutionary design, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that appearances can conceal subtle ecological details. A softly persistent belief imagines that all tarantulas are aggressive. Picture. Softly. A shadowed corner of a quiet room, webbing faintly glinting in slanted light, a tarantula pausing with delicate legs folded. In truth, many tarantula species are docile, shy, and retreat at the slightest disturbance, only rarely resorting to defensive postures or biting. Each subtle movement of legs, each careful orientation of sensory hairs, each slow flick of pedipalps. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may interpret size and fangs as universal threat, softening cautious or reclusive behavior into exaggerated aggression. Imagine softly a tarantula exploring slowly, currents of air brushing its carapace, limbs articulating with gentle deliberation. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift, emphasizing danger while overlooking calm, secretive behavior. Each careful step, each minor adjustment, each subtle pause. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Tarantulas navigate life with measured intent, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that behavior varies quietly across species. Another quietly whispered notion suggests that seals are universally friendly. Picture. Softly. A rocky shoreline, water lapping lazily, a seal lifting its head, whiskers twitching ever so slightly. In reality, wild seals can be cautious or even dangerous, especially when approached too closely or protecting pups. Each slow blink, each gentle shift of the body, each measured rotation of the head. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may anthropomorphize curiosity as friendliness, softening instinctual caution into perceived warmth. Imagine softly a seal resting on sun-warmed stones, observing tidal patterns, breath visible in the cool air. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift, emphasizing playful interactions while overlooking defensive tendencies. Each careful movement, each subtle vocalization, each measured repositioning. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Seals navigate their environment with quiet attentiveness, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that wild animals act according to instinct rather than expectation. A quietly circulating idea imagines that all frogs croak. Picture. Softly. A misty pond, lily pads drifting gently, a frog poised on a smooth leaf, throat swelling ever so subtly. In truth, some species are silent or use alternative sounds for communication, relying on gestures, vibrations, or chemical signals. Each slow blink, each careful adjustment of posture, each subtle extension of limbs. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may generalize croaking as universal, softening diverse communication strategies into a single sound. Imagine softly. A frog surveying the pond, water rippling faintly with each measured movement, skin glistening under filtered sunlight. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing familiar vocalizations while overlooking silent or non-vocal behaviors. Each gentle hop, each measured breath, each subtle interaction. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Frogs communicate in diverse, quiet ways, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that subtlety is integral to animal life. A gently circulating notion suggests that dolphins use sonar to stun fish. Picture. Softly. A calm bay, rippling water reflecting muted light, a dolphin dipping slightly, sending out clicks and whistles. In reality, echolocation assists navigation and hunting, but there is no evidence that sound alone stuns prey. Each slow flick of the tail, each subtle orientation of the head, each measured burst of clicks. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may imagine dramatic, science fiction abilities, softening sophisticated sensory use into exaggerated effect. Imagine softly. A dolphin gliding past schools of fish, currents brushing skin, mouth slightly open, breathing steady. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing imagined effects while overlooking precise biological function. Each careful maneuver, each subtle dive, each measured surfacing. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Dolphins employ sophisticated senses quietly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that reality is more subtle than myth. Another softly whispered idea is that parrots talk to communicate with humans. Picture. Softly. A sunlit aviary, leaves outside fluttering, a parrot tilting its head, beak slightly open. In reality, parrots mimic sounds without understanding linguistic meaning. Communication is not equivalent to comprehension. Each slow motion of the beak, each careful turn of the eye, each subtle adjustment of feathers. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may project understanding where mimicry occurs, softening imitation into comprehension. Imagine softly. A parrot adjusting stance, vocalizing patterns it has learned, movements measured. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing apparent conversation while overlooking cognitive limitations. Each gentle squawk, each subtle shift, each slow glance. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Parrots engage their environment thoughtfully, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that imitation is not understanding. A quietly circulating belief imagines that all snakes are cold and slimy. Picture. Softly. A sun-warmed forest floor, leaves drifting lazily, a snake coiled around a branch. In truth, snake's skin is dry and often smooth, scaled for protection and moisture retention. Each subtle flick of the tongue, each measured movement, each gentle adjustment of muscles. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may imagine sliminess from myths or media, softening reality into exaggerated sensation. Imagine softly. A snake gliding over moss, sunlight reflecting off scales, muscles flexing slowly. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing imagined texture while overlooking actual integumentary structure. Each careful coil, each subtle slide, each gentle pause. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Snakes navigate their environment with quiet, precise skin mechanics, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that perception can be misleading. A softly persistent notion imagines that only male peacocks have colorful tails. Picture. Softly. A quiet forest clearing, dappled light filtering through branches, a peahen moving among ferns. In truth. True for most, but some females display bright feathers due to genetic or hormonal variation, though less elaborate than males. Each slow step, each subtle flick of plumage, each gentle tilt of the head. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers generalize sexual dimorphism, softening occasional female brightness into exception or myth. Imagine softly. A peahen pausing in sunlight, feathers catching gentle rays, movements deliberate. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing typical male ornamentation while overlooking rare female expression. Each measured turn, each subtle adjustment, each quiet motion. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Peafowl navigate appearance and signaling subtly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that nature is more nuanced than simple rules. A softly circulating notion imagines that bats always live in caves. Picture. Softly. A quiet forest at dusk, shadows stretching across mossy undergrowth, a bat flicking its wings in gentle arcs as it flutters between branches. In reality, many bats roost in trees, beneath bridges, or within buildings, taking advantage of sheltered spots that provide warmth, concealment, and safety from predators. Each measured flap, each slow rotation of the head, each careful adjustment of claws to grasp bark or ledge. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may generalize cave-dwelling behavior from a few prominent species, softening diverse roosting habits into a single story. Imagine softly. A bat curling into the crook of a branch, wings tucked, breath steady, entirely still. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing dark, enclosed caves while overlooking adaptive flexibility. Each slow stretch, each deliberate repositioning, each subtle pause. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Bats navigate their environment with quiet ingenuity, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that shelter is chosen carefully and variably. A quietly persistent belief imagines that all elephants have tusks. Picture. Softly. A sunlit savanna, grasses bending under a gentle breeze, a large elephant standing near a shallow pool. In truth, some individuals, particularly females in certain populations, are naturally tuskless due to genetic variation, a subtle adaptation influenced by natural selection and poaching pressures. Each slow swing of the trunk, each deliberate step of massive feet, each gentle flick of ears. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may generalize from iconic tusked males, softening the presence of tuskless elephants into myth. Imagine softly. An elephant drinking quietly, trunk curling, skin glistening with moisture, entirely still, entirely alive. Entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing tusks while overlooking evolutionary and genetic nuance. Each careful movement, each subtle shift, each slow interaction with surroundings. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Elephants embody diversity quietly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that appearances do not always reflect population variation. Another quietly circulated idea is that raccoons wash all their food. Picture. Softly. A twilight stream, water moving slowly around smooth stones, a raccoon delicately holding a small morsel of food. In reality, raccoons manipulate food in both water and dry contexts, probing, squeezing, and testing items for texture, size, and suitability rather than cleanliness. Each slow movement of nimble paws, each subtle rotation of the morsel, each deliberate sniff and nibble. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may imagine constant washing from occasional water use, softening exploratory and sensory behavior into ritualized cleaning. Imagine softly. A raccoon pausing, whiskers twitching, fingers flexing lightly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing water interaction while overlooking tactile examination. Each gentle turn, each careful adjustment, each measured bite. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Raccoons engage with their environment thoughtfully, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that behavior is nuanced and context-dependent. A softly persistent belief suggests that all penguins are black and white. Picture. Softly. A frozen shoreline, pale light reflecting off ice, a penguin waddling across snow. In truth, many species display bright colors such as yellows, oranges, or subtle pinks on feathers, beaks, or crests, often for communication or mating displays. Each measured step, each slow tilt of the head, each careful preening movement. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may simplify penguin appearance to iconic monochrome, softening colorful diversity into myth. Imagine softly. A penguin pausing, eyes scanning surroundings, light catching subtle hues along feathers. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing black and white while overlooking nuanced plumage. Each gentle movement, each subtle adjustment, each slow preen. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Penguins embody quiet diversity, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that appearances vary with species and context. A gently whispered notion imagines that all jellyfish drift passively. Picture. Softly. A sun-dappled tide pool, water moving lazily around transparent, bell-shaped bodies, tentacles floating like thin ribbons. In reality, some jellyfish actively swim using pulsing contractions of the bell to navigate currents, hunt prey, or adjust position, albeit slowly and delicately. Each gentle pulse, each subtle shift of tentacles, each measured motion through water. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may generalize passive drifting from apparent drift patterns, softening occasional active movement into myth. Imagine softly. A jellyfish gliding slowly, bell contracting and expanding, currents brushing delicate appendages. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing passivity while overlooking subtle propulsion mechanisms. Each gentle pulse, each careful maneuver, each quiet rotation. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Jellyfish navigate fluid environments with delicate intent, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that movement is often subtle, not absent. Another quietly persistent idea suggests that kangaroos can hop backwards. Picture. Softly. A sunlit grassy plain, blades bending under a slow breeze, a kangaroo pausing mid-step, tail anchored lightly. In truth, anatomical structure, particularly the musculoskeletal arrangement of hips, knees, and tail, prevents backward hopping, and forward motion dominates locomotion. Each careful placement of hind limbs, each subtle shift of weight, each measured adjustment of tail for balance. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may imagine reverse hopping from cartoons or stylized illustrations, softening anatomical limitation into playful myth. Imagine softly. A kangaroo resting, tail touching earth, chest rising and falling slowly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing imagined abilities while overlooking biomechanical constraints. Each deliberate hop, each slow pause, each careful weight transfer. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Kangaroos navigate their environment with measured intent, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that physics shapes movement quietly and reliably. A quietly circulating belief suggests that all butterflies migrate. Picture. Softly. A meadow awash in gentle sunlight, wildflowers swaying slowly, wings of delicate butterflies flitting through the air in lazy arcs. In reality, only some species, such as the monarch butterfly, undertake long-distance migrations, while many others remain close to their birthplace, feeding and reproducing locally. Each measured flap of wings, each subtle adjustment of antennae, each gentle pause upon a petal. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may generalize from spectacular migrations, softening localized life cycles into myth. Imagine softly. A butterfly resting atop a dew-laden leaf, wings catching the light, tiny legs clinging delicately, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing motion and distance while overlooking everyday patterns. Each subtle wing beat, each slow turn of the head, each careful landing. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Butterflies navigate their habitats with quiet intention, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that not all journeys span continents. Another gently whispered notion is that polar bears never overheat. Picture. Softly. A tundra bathed in long afternoon sun, snow sparkling faintly, a bear walking slowly across a gentle slope. In truth, polar bears can suffer heat stress in warm conditions, and behaviors such as seeking shade, entering water, or slowing activity help them regulate body temperature. Each measured paw placement, each subtle flex of massive muscles, each slow shift of weight. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may imagine constant cold tolerance, softening thermal sensitivity into myth. Imagine softly. A polar bear resting beside a small pool, breath quiet, skin and fur interacting with air and snow. Entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift. Emphasizing icy endurance while overlooking physiological limitations. Each deliberate movement, each slow exhale, each gentle adjustment of posture. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Polar bears respond to warmth quietly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that life balances delicately with environmental conditions. Some quietly believe that cats can't swim. Picture. Softly. A calm pond surrounded by reeds, water glinting faintly, a cat pausing at the edge, whiskers twitching. In reality, many cats can swim, though most prefer to avoid water unless necessary, relying on instinctive paddling when immersed. Each measured step into shallows, each subtle shift of body, each careful stroke of paws. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may generalize avoidance behavior, softening occasional aquatic competence into myth. Imagine softly. A cat gliding briefly in water, fur sleek, tail trailing lightly, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift, emphasizing aversion while overlooking capability. Each deliberate motion, each slow adjustment, each gentle paddling. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Cats navigate water selectively, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that preference and ability may differ quietly. A quietly persistent idea suggests that all bees sting. Picture, softly, a garden full of flowers, sunlight drifting across petals, a bee moving delicately from bloom to bloom. In truth, male bees, known as drones, cannot sting. Only female workers possess stingers, which are used defensively or for colony protection. Each measured wingbeat, each subtle rotation of the body, each gentle probing of a flower's surface. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Observers may imagine universal stinging, softening caste-based biology into myth. Imagine softly. A drone hovering near nectar, legs extended, antennae waving gently, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely natural. Myths drift, emphasizing potential danger while overlooking biological reality. Each careful landing, each slow turn, each quiet pause. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely unnoticed. Bees perform their roles with quiet intent, entirely ordinary, entirely alive, entirely persistent, softly reminding us that nature is divided thoughtfully among its participants. If your eyes are closed, if your thoughts are drifting, then my job here is done for today. Thank you for spending this unremarkable moment with me. You have listened to The Sleepy Sloth, where uninteresting things become the softest lullabies.